It is October 1981 in a quiet Ohio town. The leaves are turning. The air is crisp, and for most families in this small community, life moves at a peaceful pace. But behind one modest home, a tragedy is about to unfold that will shatter a mother's world and challenge everything she believes about her daughter. This is the story of Sheila Marie Blackburn, and the questions that have haunted her family for over 4 decades. Sheila Marie Blackburn is 16 years old. She has her whole life ahead of her, dreams, plans, a future that stretches out in every direction. Her mother, Betty, knows her daughter better than anyone. They've had their struggles, their arguments, their moments of silence, but the bond between them is unbreakable. Betty has watched Sheila grow from a curious child into a young woman finding her way in the world. On this October morning, neither of them knows that their lives are about to be torn apart. It is a cold October morning, the kind where your breath fogs in the air and you reach for your warmest jacket. Sheila has told her mother she is stepping outside, just for a moment to feed the dog. It is a simple errand, the kind that takes seconds, a casual task between two ordinary people living ordinary lives. Betty nods, maybe says something about hurrying back before the coffee gets cold. It is such a normal thing to say. It is the kind of thing mothers say every single day, never imagining it might be the last words they ever exchange. Minutes pass, then more minutes. Betty goes about her morning routine, maybe glancing at the clock, maybe not thinking much of it at first. Teenagers disappear for hours sometimes. It is normal, it is nothing. But something doesn't feel right. A mother's intuition is a powerful thing, and Betty's begins to scream at her. She checks the rooms. She calls out. No answer. The silence in the house grows heavier. She steps outside, scanning the yard, the street, the familiar places where her daughter should be. Behind their home, past the yard where the trees grow thick and the October wind whistles through bare branches, Betty finds her daughter. 16-year-old Sheila Marie Blackburn is hanging from a tree. The scene is something no mother should ever have to witness, something that burns itself into memory and never leaves. Betty's world shatters in an instant. Everything she was, everything she had been just moments ago, is obliterated. This can't be real, this can't be happening, but it is real, and it is happening, and there is no waking up from this nightmare. Within hours, police arrive on the scene. Lights flash in the quiet neighborhood as officers tape off the area and begin their work. They examine the tree, the rope, or whatever suspended Sheila from its branches. They examine her body with clinical detachment. Reporters begin gathering at the edges of the crime scene tape, drawn by the tragedy of a young life lost. The neighbors watch from their porches, whispering, trying to make sense of something that makes no sense at all. Before the day is even over, before the sun sets on this October morning, investigators reach their conclusion: suicide, case closed. The decision is swift, almost efficient. A young girl took her own life. They have determined this, and their determination is final. The papers will print it. The neighbors will nod knowingly. Life in the quiet Ohio town will move on, as it always does. But for Betty Blackburn, the nightmare is just beginning, because she knows her daughter, and she knows something is terribly wrong. Betty looked at her daughter's body and saw things that didn't add up. She saw bruising, significant bruising, that officers seemed all too willing to dismiss or explain away with convenient theories. She saw marks on Sheila's body that suggested something other than a simple hanging. Wounds that told a story of struggle, of violence, of a young girl who might not have gone quietly into those woods. But her observations fell on deaf ears, on minds already made up, on an investigative process that had already reached its conclusion. And then there was the jacket. Sheila had been wearing a jacket that October morning. It was cold outside, cold enough to see your breath, cold enough to make you reach for your warmest layers. Betty remembers her daughter putting on that jacket, remembers thinking she was dressed warmly enough. But when they found her body in those woods, the jacket was gone. Never found. The investigators didn't seem concerned. Why would a girl removing her jacket in cold weather be significant? But to Betty, the missing jacket was everything. Betty asked questions. She demanded answers. She pointed to the inconsistencies, to the bruising that didn't match a simple hanging, to the missing jacket that made no sense, and she begged investigators to look deeper. She wasn't accusing anyone. Not yet. She just wanted to understand. She just wanted someone in authority to take a second look at the evidence, to consider the possibility that their initial conclusion might be wrong. But in 1981, in a small town, A grieving mother was not someone investigators were inclined to listen to. Because in 1981, in a small town, a young girl's death wasn't always examined with the scrutiny it deserved, especially when authorities had already made up their minds, especially when the convenient box of suicide could close an investigation before it truly began. The forensic technology of the era was limited. The investigative protocols were often inadequate, and the cultural attitudes toward young women who died under suspicious circumstances meant that cases like Sheila's were sometimes closed without the thorough examination they demanded. Sheila's case wasn't unique. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, young women who died under suspicious circumstances were often categorized too quickly, too conveniently. Suicide was a box that investigators could check to close cases without the messy work of genuine inquiry. Evidence was overlooked. Witnesses weren't questioned thoroughly or sometimes at all. Families like the Blackburns were left with nothing but grief, frustration, and the unbearable weight of unanswered questions. It was a systemic failure, a pattern of dismissal that claimed victims even after their deaths. The missing jacket bothered Betty more than anything else. Why would a girl who walked outside to feed the dog remove her jacket? The morning was cold, cold enough that Betty remembered her daughter bundling up before stepping out. Why would she take it into the woods? The dog food was kept near the house, near the back door, nowhere near the tree line. And if Sheila was truly planning to take her own life, why would she strip down first? These weren't speculative questions born from denial. They were logical conclusions drawn from the physical evidence, or lack thereof. The bruising on Sheila's body suggested she had been moved after death, or worse, that she had been fighting. These weren't the marks that would result from a person ending their own life. These were the marks of struggle, of violence, of someone resisting an attacker. The marks on her body told a story that contradicted the official narrative completely. Yet that story went untold, buried beneath the convenient label of suicide that allowed everyone to move on with their lives. Everyone except Betty, who would carry these contradictions with her forever. But in 1981, Betty's voice was just a grieving mother against a system that had already decided what happened. She wasn't a detective. She wasn't a forensic expert. She was just a mother who had lost her daughter, and her grief made her biased in the eyes of investigators. Her questions were the desperate ravings of a woman who couldn't accept reality. Her theories were the delusions of someone in denial. This was how they saw her, not as a witness to inconsistencies, but as an obstacle to closing the case. Betty had no power in this system. She had no authority. She had only the truth, and no one wanted to hear it. For over 40 years, Sheila Marie Blackburn became a forgotten name. The case file gathered dust in some forgotten archive. The witnesses who might have seen something moved away grew old or died. The evidence that wasn't properly preserved was lost to time. And Sheila herself faded from public memory, another name on a cold case list. Another tragedy that the world moved on from. For most people, she became just a statistic, just another teenage suicide from a difficult era. But Betty Blackburn never stopped asking questions, never stopped wondering what really happened to her daughter, never stopped believing that the official story was wrong. She shared her concerns with anyone who would listen, to journalists who wrote small stories that went nowhere, to victim advocates who promised help but had limited power, to anyone who might help keep the case alive. Year after year, she carried her daughter's memory and her unanswered questions like a weight that would never lift. But the system had moved on. Without new evidence or new attention, Sheila's death remained locked in the past, a suicide on paper, a mystery in practice. The investigators who handled the case either retired or passed away. The department moved on to newer cases, newer tragedies. The town that once whispered about the Blackburn girl moved on too, the story fading into local legend and then disappearing entirely. Only Betty remembered. Only Betty kept the flame of doubt alive in a world that had decided to forget. Then, something changed. Decades after Sheila's death, her case caught renewed attention. Advocates for cold case reform began pushing for re-examinations of questionable rulings from the early 1980s. Forensic technology had advanced far beyond what was available in 1981. DNA analysis, digital enhancement, new investigative protocols. All of these offered possibilities that simply didn't exist when investigators first closed Sheila's case. And as perspectives on investigative failures evolved, cases like Sheila's finally got a second look. The reopening of her case represented more than just procedural review. It was an acknowledgement that the initial investigation had failed, that a young girl's death had been simplified into a suicide label without proper examination, that a grieving mother had been dismissed and ignored when she asked the questions that should have been asked from the beginning. This acknowledgement mattered. It validated Betty's decades of doubt. It confirmed that her instincts were right, that she wasn't simply a mother in denial. The system had failed her daughter, and finally, someone was willing to admit it. But reopening a case doesn't guarantee answers, and for many cold cases from this era, the damage of those early decisions may be irreparable. Evidence that should have been preserved was never collected. Witnesses who might have remembered crucial details have faded or passed away. The crime scene itself has been disturbed, contaminated, lost to the decades. The investigation that should have happened in 1981 cannot be recreated now. All that remains are fragments, the questions that were never answered, and the hope that some truth might still be recovered. To this day, questions linger about Sheila Marie Blackburn's death. What caused the bruising on her body? Who took her jacket, and why? Was she truly alone in those woods that October morning, or did someone follow her outside? What happened in the hours between when she stepped out to feed the dog and when her mother found her hanging? These aren't idle questions, the products of a grieving mother's imagination. They are the questions that logical analysis of the evidence demands. They are the questions that should have been asked in 1981. These aren't idle questions. They're the questions that Betty Blackburn carried with her for over 40 years. They're the questions that families across America still ask when the system fails to give them answers. When their grief is dismissed, their doubts are explained away, and their loved ones become nothing more than closed case files gathering dust. Betty's fight wasn't just for Sheila. It was for every family sitting in the same darkness, searching for truth in a system designed to close cases rather than solve them. Betty Blackburn's refusal to accept her daughter's death as a simple suicide wasn't just a personal choice. It was an act of resistance against a system that had already decided her daughter's story. She fought for recognition when recognition was denied. She fought for investigation when investigation was refused. She fought for truth when truth was inconvenient. In a world that wanted to forget, Betty remembered. In a system that wanted to close the book, Betty kept it open. Her persistence was not weakness. It was the strongest kind of strength. While we may never know exactly what happened to Sheila Marie Blackburn, her case reminds us of something crucial. Behind every suicide ruling in an unsolved case, there may be a story that was never properly told. There may be questions that were never asked, evidence that was never collected, witnesses that were never interviewed. There may be mothers like Betty who knew something was wrong and were never believed. Cold cases aren't just puzzles to be solved. They're people who were failed, and their stories deserve to be heard. The darkness doesn't always bring answers. Sometimes, after decades of silence, the truth remains forever lost, swallowed by time, by neglect, by the limitations of justice. But sometimes, decades later, the darkness brings a second chance to ask the questions that should have been asked from the beginning. It brings attention to cases that were forgotten. It brings new technology that can extract truth from degraded evidence. It brings fresh eyes to look at old mistakes. And it brings acknowledgement to families like Betty Blackburn that their doubts were justified. The case files reopen. The evidence is re-examined with modern techniques and fresh perspectives. The questions that Betty asked for over 40 years are finally being asked by investigators with the resources and will to pursue answers. It may be too late for perfect justice. There may be no way to fully recreate what happened on that October morning in 1981. But for Sheila Marie Blackburn, the search for truth continues, and for Betty Blackburn, there is finally hope that her daughter's story might be told properly. We must acknowledge the possibility that some questions may never be answered. The evidence that might confirm what happened to Sheila Marie Blackburn may be forever lost. The witnesses who might have seen something that October morning may be gone. The jacket that might have held crucial evidence may never be found. This is the tragedy of cold cases, the reality that some doors, once closed, cannot be reopened fully. But even partial answers matter. Even the acknowledgement of failure matters. Even the act of asking questions that were never asked matters. What we can do is remember Sheila Marie Blackburn, not as a closed case file, not as a suicide statistic, but as a 16-year-old girl who stepped outside to feed her dog on an October morning and never came back. We can remember Betty Blackburn, not as a grieving mother whose concerns were dismissed, but as a hero who fought for truth when no one else would. And we can demand better, not just for Sheila and Betty, but for every family who has lost someone to suspicious circumstances and been denied the answers they deserve. The case files reopen, and for Sheila Marie Blackburn, the search for truth continues. In Ohio in 1981, a 16-year-old girl lost her life under circumstances that were never properly examined. Her mother spent over 40 years demanding answers. And now, finally, someone is listening. We may never know exactly what happened in those woods on that October morning, but we know that Sheila Marie Blackburn deserves the truth, and we know that Betty Blackburn was right to never stop fighting for it. Her story reminds us that behind every cold case, there is a life that mattered, and a family that still cares.